Hello, my friend. Hi there. Guy listening in the quiet of your room, maybe with the lights dimmed low, maybe with your phone resting just a little too warmly in your palm. Good evening to you, or good morning depending on the strange hour your body has chosen to resist sleep. You are here with me, and I am here with you. And together we are about to step back, not in jolts or leaps, but with the steady softness of drifting into a dream. I always like to imagine these stories not as lessons, not as lectures, not as something to keep you rigid and alert, but as something that folds itself around you like a blanket, something to loosen the mind while still feeding it with little tastes of history, little sips of forgotten worlds. Have you ever wondered, as you close your eyes, what the most powerful woman in the 19th century might have reached for when her stomach rumbled late in the evening? Have you ever thought of Queen Victoria, not in her strict black dresses or her stern portrait staring down from a museum wall, but simply as a woman, perhaps sighing as she longed for a plate of something indulgent, something sweet or greasy, something we would call junk food today? It is a peculiar question, I know, but peculiar questions are often the best companions in these late, hushed hours. When we say junk food now, our minds leap toward neon wrappers, potato chips crumbling in their bags, fast food drive-thrus glowing under sodium lights. But of course, in the Victorian world, no drive-thru existed. No plastic straw rattled against a paper cup. Their junk food was a different creature, born out of soot and sugar, out of industry and empire, out of the restless energy of a city like London, swelling and choking with smoke. And Queen Victoria herself, tucked away in Buckingham Palace or Osborne House, was not entirely removed from those cravings. She too had her favorites, her guilty little indulgences, though served on fine porcelain and never wrapped in paper. Tonight, or this morning, depending on your clock, I want you to let yourself slide gently into that world. Picture not the grand crown glimmering on her head, but a small, ordinary plate resting at her side. Imagine the palace kitchens humming with the clatter of copper pots, the hiss of boiling fat, the shuffle of scullery maids wiping their hands on stained aprons. Imagine the scent, at once enticing and overwhelming, of roasted meats dripping their grease onto bread, of sugared pastries sticking stubbornly to trays. Imagine the laughter of the kitchen boys sneaking a bite when the cook's back was turned. Junk food in that age was not hidden behind drive-through windows, but paraded in the streets, piled high on trays balanced by shouting vendors. And sometimes, it even found its way onto the royal menu. And so I ask you, have you ever thought about the Queen nibbling on something she wasn't supposed to? Have you considered how strange it is that even the most powerful woman in the world could not resist the human pull toward salt, sugar, and fat? Perhaps you felt that same tug yourself, late at night, standing in front of the refrigerator door with its light spilling across your tired face. It makes her suddenly more human, doesn't it? That shared hunger, that small rebellion against discipline. But before we wander too far into her personal plate, let me draw you gently into the streets of her empire. Because to understand Queen Victoria's junk food, you must first taste the world around her. The buzzing stalls of London's East End, the sticky sweets sold to children with pennies in their fists, the fried fish sizzling in oil so old it carried yesterday's flavors. You must hear the calls of the vendors, the creak of wagon wheels delivering yet more sugar from Caribbean colonies, yet more tea from India, yet more chocolate pressed into bars that melted quickly against the warmth of a child's hand. Junk food is always the story of abundance, meeting impatience, of people unwilling to wait for a proper meal, of craving colliding with opportunity. And the Victorian age, with its steam engines and its factories, with its restless workers and restless royals, was fertile ground for that craving to flourish. Now, my friend, take a breath with me. Let the rhythm slow. Let your eyelids feel just a touch heavier. We are not racing, we are gliding. And as we glide, I want you to picture the Queen not as the stern widow draped eternally in black, but as the young Victoria, lively, curious, newly married to Albert, giggling perhaps as she sneaks a sweet between meals. History softens when you tilt your head just a little. The lines of power blur, and what remains is simply a person. That is where the comfort lies, and the curiosity too. Queen Victoria's reign stretched over decades, and so too did her relationship with food. There were the official banquets, stiff with ceremony, groaning tables of roasts and puddings. But then there were the quieter indulgences, the unexpected cravings. She loved simple things, sometimes shockingly simple for a monarch. Bread and butter, boiled eggs, a piece of fruit, and yet she also adored sweets that we would now consider a kind of sugary sin. Chocolate eclairs, cakes so dense with sugar they stuck to the fork. And later in life, she became fond of what we might call proto-snacks, little fried morsels that satisfied more than they nourished. If you lean closer with your imagination, you can almost hear the soft crunch, the faint sigh of satisfaction. And if you lean even closer, you notice how her tastes mirrored her people's. Junk food has always been democratic in that way. It ignores titles. The same sugared almond that melted on the tongue of a princess could be purchased in cheaper form by a factory worker saving a penny for a Sunday treat. That shared craving is what ties the queen's plate to the crowded alleys outside her palace gates. And perhaps, as you are listening, you are wondering why it matters, why we should linger on these small indulgences when the Victorian world was filled with railroads, wars, colonies, inventions, tragedies. But I would suggest that it matters because it makes the age more intimate. Grand events roll past us like heavy wagons, but it is the small details, the taste of a sugared bun, the greasy shine of fried fish that bring the past close enough to touch. And for you, lying there in the present, it is comforting to know that even in the strict, soot-laden 19th century, people longed for the same little pleasures you long for today. So stay with me. Don't drift off just yet, though your eyes may be heavy. We are about to wander more deeply into that world, into the kitchens and the streets, into the palace and the pubs. We will see what Queen Victoria reached for, what her people craved, and how the very idea of junk food, though not named as such, began to take shape in the shadows of her empire. And as we move, remember, history is not meant to rush you. History can be as gentle as a lullaby, if you let it. You can almost hear the streets before you see them, the clatter of boots against cobblestones, the soft hiss of gas lamps trembling in the night air, the chatter of voices echoing through narrow alleys that never seem to end. And somewhere within that restless rhythm, the scent of frying batter curling its way upward, slipping past the soot-stained bricks and into the lungs of everyone who walked by. This was London in the heart of Queen Victoria's reign, a city swollen with people and possibility, a city where industry pressed down with its iron hand, but also lifted with its strange new abundance. And in that strange abundance, food took on a new form. It was not the elegant multi-course dinners of aristocrats, nor the meager porridge of paupers alone, but something in between, cheap enough to grab quickly, flavorful enough to comfort, and satisfying enough to make you forget, for a moment, the grinding weight of your day. It was what we would now call junk food, though the Victorians themselves never gave it such a name. Imagine the glow of the East End at dusk, the smoke of factories lingering low, children darting barefoot through puddles that reflected broken patches of lamplight, and vendors raising their voices above the noise of horses and carts. Their cries carried the promise of something indulgent. Fried fish, spitting in pans of oil that had been used more times than anyone would dare to admit, meat pies with their crusts cracked and oozing with thick gravy, buns glazed in syrup that clung to the fingers long after the sweetness had faded from the tongue. These were the treats of the ordinary people, but their scent did not stop at the edges of poverty. Smell knows no class, and when the Queen herself found pleasure in the occasional sweet or fried morsel, she was tethered, however faintly, to these very streets. The palace kitchens were a different world, of course. Polished copper gleaming, chefs in stiff white coats, endless servants carrying trays with hands steady from practice. But indulgence, that craving for food that exists purely for pleasure rather than nourishment, is not something you can entirely seal off with gilded gates. It seeps through the walls, it lingers in the tongue's memory, and Victoria, despite the strict rituals of her meals, felt its pull. It is soothing, in a way, to think of her not only at banquets where every fork was polished to perfection, but also at tea tables where she allowed herself sweets so rich they clung to the throat, or savory bites that belonged more to the streets than to the throne. Close your eyes with me and picture her as a young queen, barely into her 20s, eyes still bright with the stubborn spark of youth. She had married Albert, and though their lives were wrapped in ceremony, they shared moments of surprising simplicity. Tea was their comfort, not just the drink but the ritual of it, and with tea came cakes, small, moist, almost careless in their sweetness. She was said to have an affection for sponge cakes, but not the delicate dry ones. No, hers were drenched in jam, layered with cream, heavy enough to make the plate feel weighted. If you tilt your head and think of it in our modern terms, it was the Victorian cousin of junk food. Sugar piled on sugar, softness giving way to stickiness, indulgence wrapped in the illusion of something ordinary. The Victorians as a whole had a relationship with sugar that bordered on obsession, and this obsession did not bypass the Queen. Britain's empire ensured an unending stream of sugar from its colonies, and it transformed the very way the people ate. What had once been rare became cheap, what had once been treasured became common, and soon even the poor could buy little cones of sugar to gnaw, or boiled sweets to roll around in their mouths on Sundays. For Victoria, it meant that her tables could always be supplied with jams, pastries, puddings, and all manner of candy-like creations. And in those choices, in the way she reached for sugar again and again, you see the whisper of junk food, easy pleasure, quick satisfaction, the triumph of sweetness over restraint. But junk food is never just about taste, it is about the moment, the break from discipline. Think of the workers spilling out of factories, their lungs lined with coal dust, their fingers aching from machinery. They wanted not a balanced meal but something immediate, something to silence hunger with a rush of salt or sugar. And though she did not labor in factories, the Queen too lived within routines that pressed upon her. The endless ceremonies, the performances of power, the careful image of monarchy, these were their own kind of machinery. And perhaps when she reached for a sugared bun or a fried bite, she too was reaching for a moment of rebellion, a brief departure from the rules that bound her. That is the secret kinship of junk food. It belongs equally to the factory hand and the monarch, because it answers the same quiet yearning. The streets reflected this, yearning with vivid clarity. Imagine standing near the Thames as the evening fog rolled in, the air damp with smoke, and hearing the cry of a vendor hawking roasted chestnuts, their shells splitting with a satisfying crack. Children clustered with their pennies, workers reached into their pockets for small change, and the smell of hot chestnut flesh filled the air. They were cheap, they were warm, they were filling, and they were sold everywhere. Victoria herself was known to enjoy them, not in the same setting, not in the cold streets, but roasted in palace kitchens, served in bowls, yet still carrying that primal comfort of warmth and fat, and the simple joy of eating with your fingers. Junk food crosses boundaries because it offers more than calories, it offers reassurance, a little whisper that says, "The world is hard, but this bite is easy." There is something deeply human in that, and as we glide through this history, I want you to feel it not as distant facts, but as a rhythm that hums beneath your own life. Think of the late-night cravings you have felt, the guilty snacks, the sweets you told yourself you wouldn't eat but did anyway, and realize that the Queen of England, draped in power, felt the same. That is the comfort of these small histories. They remind us that the past was not only wars and inventions and treaties, but also cravings and indulgences, sugar on the tongue, grease on the fingers, laughter shared over food that was not necessary but was irresistible. And yet, the indulgence had shadows. For the poor, the junk food of the Victorian age was sometimes all they could afford, filling their stomachs without nourishing their bodies. Fried fish, its batter heavy with oil, pies stuffed with questionable meat, sweets dyed with dangerous chemicals to make them appear more tempting. These were cheap, quick, and deadly in the long run. For Victoria, the shadows were different. Her health was not ruined by poverty food, but by the very excess of abundance. Later in her life, her appetite remained famously strong, her meals large and frequent, and indulgences piled on indulgences. The line between nourishment and overindulgence blurred, and though she was queen, she was also mortal, her body bearing the weight of her choices just as her people bore theirs. So when we think of Queen Victoria's junk food, we must think not only of the items themselves, the cakes, the sweets, the roasted chestnuts, the fried morsels, but also of what they represented. They were comfort, rebellion, indulgence, and sometimes even danger. They were the taste of an empire that had flooded the nation with sugar, the whisper of modern snacking taking its first form, the link between rich and poor forged by the tongue's simplest desires. And above all, they remind us that even the grandest figures are still tethered to the same cravings as the rest of us. As you lie here listening, perhaps letting your body grow heavier against the mattress, I want you to let that image settle in your mind. The queen, sitting in her palace, lifting a sugared bun to her lips, and outside her gates, a child doing the same with a cheaper sweet, both of them caught in the same moment of human satisfaction. It is not grandeur, it is not ceremony, it is simply the pleasure of taste, and in that, history softens, loses its edges, becomes something you can almost reach out and touch, and that is where our journey will take us. Slowly, steadily, through the layers of her world, through the flavors that defined it, through the cravings that stitch together monarch and subject alike. For now, let the streets of London fade gently into the background of your thoughts. Let the scent of frying batter and sugared buns dissolve into a haze, and know that in the next breath of our story, we will step deeper still into the kitchens and the cravings of the queen, who reigned over an empire, but was never free from the simplest pull of hunger. If the streets of London were the restless heartbeat of Victorian junk food, then the palace kitchens were its echo chamber, vast and hidden, where cravings were transformed into something both refined and indulgent, a world where grease was wiped away with linen, where sugar was piled high but disguised beneath porcelain elegance, where indulgence did not scream from a street vendor's throat but arrived quietly, carried by the steady hands of servants who knew that even a queen could be softened by the promise of a sweet bite. Step with me into those kitchens now, not rushing, but easing yourself through the corridors, hearing the muffled shuffle of footsteps, the creak of wooden doors, the distant clink of silver trays being set upon stone counters. The palace above was filled with ceremony, but here below, heat reigned, and the smells that rose upward were often less majestic than human, thick with fat, heavy with the dampness of steam, layered with sugar that caramelized and clung to every surface. This was not the pristine world of portraits. This was where Victoria's indulgences were born. The kitchens themselves were almost kingdoms, ruled by chefs who carried their authority as sternly as generals, their commands slicing through the steam, their tempers quick when a sauce was scorched or a pastry collapsed. And within this hidden empire of copper pots and iron ranges, indulgence had its own hierarchy. The roasts and puddings for state banquets were the grand showpieces, carefully constructed, but the real whispers of comfort, the foods that might draw the queen's hand with something close to mischief, were smaller, humbler things, the Victorian cousins of what we might call snacks or junk food today. A sponge cake layered with jam, a fritter dripping faintly with oil, sugared nuts cracked open with the ease of a careless bite. These were not the dishes meant to impress ambassadors, but they were the ones that satisfied the simplest cravings of the woman who ruled an empire. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the sounds: knives tapping against boards, dough slapped and rolled, fat sizzling in pans, the kitchen boys laughing under their breath until a stern glance silenced them. Imagine the aromas weaving together, meat roasting slowly, onions softening in butter, and from the corner, something sweeter, trays of buns glazed to a sticky shine, their tops golden and faintly caramelized, waiting for the moment they would be carried up to the tea table. For Victoria, tea was more than ritual. It was the moment indulgence was allowed to creep in. At state dinners, she was bound by ceremony, by forks and courses, but at tea, she let her guard slip, and what slipped in alongside were the small temptations of sugar and starch that we might recognize as the comfort food of her day. It is said she loved jam in abundance, spread so thick it spilled from the sides of her cakes, staining the porcelain plates. Picture her lifting a fork, the cake soft and crumbling, the jam sticky and bright, and imagine how familiar that is, how close it feels to biting into a jelly-filled donut or a frosted cupcake. It is easy to think of her world as distant, but in this small act, she was not so far from us. She ate for pleasure, for comfort, sometimes for rebellion, and in those moments the palace walls thinned, the centuries shortened, and you could almost believe she might sit beside you with a guilty smile as she reached for one more bite. But kitchens do not merely produce food, they produce memory, and for Victoria, Indulgence was tied to the sweetness of youth, to the years when Albert was still by her side, when meals were punctuated with laughter instead of silence. After his death, she shrouded herself in mourning, but her appetite never dimmed. In some ways, it grew, as though food became both comfort and distraction, and the kitchens hummed with an even greater urgency to satisfy her cravings. The cooks knew her favorites, and though banquets still rolled on, there was a kind of quiet indulgence in ensuring that the queen's plate always carried something that would make her pause, something that would remind her of sweetness when her days felt drenched in grief. Think for a moment of the fried foods of that age, the fritters and little battered pieces of apple or potato that sizzled in oil. These were not so far from what a child today might grab from a fairground stall, the heat licking at the tongue, the grease soaking faintly into fingers. For a monarch to eat such things was not to join the crowds in the streets, but to allow a piece of the crowd to enter her world. And in that indulgence, a thread was drawn between palace and people, not through politics or proclamations, but through the simple truth of food that pleases. And yet, indulgence is always shadowed by consequence. The kitchens may have been places of abundance, but abundance is not without weight. Victoria's appetite was famous, her meals large, her cravings steady, and over time, her body bore that story. It is almost too easy for us to imagine junk food as guilty pleasure without cost. But in her later years, the queen grew heavy, her movements slowed, her body carrying the memory of every indulgence. And so when we think of her kitchens, we must think not only of the sweetness and comfort they produced, but also of the way those comforts lingered long after the plates were cleared. Still, there is something strangely comforting in picturing her like this, not as an untouchable monarch, but as someone whose cravings were as ordinary as ours, whose indulgences left marks upon her body as they do upon ours. The kitchens were filled with grandeur, yes, but within their steam and noise, they also carried the same whispered promise that fast food carries today. Just one bite, just one sweet, just one plate to make the day easier. Now, as you lie there with me, let your imagination soften further. Picture the glow of those kitchens, the long wooden tables, worn smooth by years of chopping, the walls darkened by smoke, the warmth of the ovens radiating against cold stone floors. See the trays of sweets lined up, hear the bubbling of oils, and realize that history is not only battles and decrees, but this, the everyday human craving satisfied in hidden rooms. For the queen, these kitchens were where comfort began, where indulgence was crafted, where the simplest human truth that food can soothe was proven again and again. And so, when you next reach for your own late-night snack, whatever it may be, remember that somewhere in those long nights of the 19th century, Queen Victoria did the same, in her way, in her kitchens, surrounded by servants, yet still bound to the same gentle hunger that binds us all. When you step away from the palace kitchens, with their steam and copper and the small rebellions of sugar-laden buns, the story does not fade but widens, because Queen Victoria's indulgences were never only about what was baked or fried within Britain's own borders. They were shaped by the restless arteries of empire that pulsed outward across oceans, bringing with them the raw materials of temptation. Sugar was not born in English soil. It was pulled from the heat of Caribbean plantations, carried in barrels across the Atlantic, refined until it gleamed like snow, and then poured into cakes, puddings, and jams that sweetened the queen's tongue. Chocolate came from beans dried in distant sun. Spices rode the waves from India. Tea leaves curled themselves into crates that perfumed the very air of London's docks. And so when Victoria lifted a sweet to her lips, she was tasting not only her own indulgence, but the hidden labor of thousands, the weight of a global machine designed to satisfy cravings. Junk food, if we stretch our gaze, was born not only of kitchens but of conquest, not only of appetite but of empire. It is a strange comfort and a strange discomfort, both at once, to imagine her late-night plate as a map of the world. The sugar in her jam linked her to fields where enslaved hands had once cut cane under a brutal sun. The tea steaming in her cup bound her to plantations where laborers bent and sweated for leaves that would never touch their lips. The chocolate she adored had its roots in soil tilled far away by people whose names she never knew. And yet for her, Those items arrived already transformed into pleasure, their journeys erased, their violence softened, until all that remained was sweetness. That is often the truth of indulgence. It hides its cost beneath its comfort. For the ordinary Londoner, too, the empire reshaped craving. The poor could afford sugar where once they could not, and so boiled sweets, bright and sticky, became the currency of childhood. Little boys carried them in their pockets, pulling them out to suck while soot settled on their faces. Girls clutched paper twists of candy dyed with colors so artificial, so toxic, they could burn the tongue and poison the blood. But poison mattered less than pleasure, and so the streets echoed with the crack of sugar between teeth. The queen herself, separated by wealth and walls, was nevertheless part of this same current. She delighted in chocolates, in the thick, dark richness that lingered on the tongue, in desserts where sugar drowned every other flavor, and though hers were prepared with more care, with safer dyes and finer ingredients, the craving was the same. Sweetness softened the edges of industrial life, whether in a palace or a tenement. Think of it as a tide. The empire sent its goods swelling into Britain, and in turn, those goods washed over every table, from the queen's gilded dining rooms to the workers' rough wooden boards. Junk food, if we use that term gently, became one of the first global languages of pleasure, uniting distant lands through trade, uniting classes through craving, uniting the past with our present. Because when you sip your own cup of tea sweetened with sugar, when you tear the foil from a bar of chocolate, you are still following the current that began in those days. Victoria was both its symbol and its participant, a monarch who represented the empire, and a woman who indulged in its sweetest fruits. But empire's indulgence was never pure. The very abundance that made sugar cheap also made it addictive, not in the strict medical sense, but in the way it rewired habits. Children longed for sweets as if nothing else mattered. Workers spent pennies they could not spare on syrup-soaked buns. And even the queen, disciplined in many aspects of her public role, was known for her remarkable appetite, her desire for second helpings, her fondness for cakes that made her meals linger. You can almost imagine her table, a delicate sponge cake, cut neatly but then consumed in generous portions, the jam staining the corners of her mouth if she forgot her etiquette for a second. Imagine the hush of a servant clearing the plate, already preparing to bring more, because indulgence rarely ends with the first taste. That is the nature of junk food. It beckons again. It whispers that satisfaction lies just one bite further, and one more after that. The empire turned those whispers into a chorus. Chocolate factories rose in Britain, refining imported beans into bars that children clamored for. Sugar was refined by the ton, baked into biscuits that could be eaten quickly in factories during short breaks. Tea became not a luxury but a necessity, its caffeine keeping tired bodies alert through long hours. And in this abundance, Victoria's cravings mirrored her people's. She was not alone in her sweet tooth. She was part of a nation transformed by its own reach. When she sipped tea, millions sipped with her. When she ate jam, millions spread the same across their bread. The distance between her plate and theirs shrank not through politics, but through palate. And yet, there is a melancholy in this too, because every indulgence was purchased at a cost borne far away. It is easy to imagine the sweetness without the sweat, but if you pause with me here, if you let your imagination drift across oceans, you will see the cane fields stretching to the horizon, the workers bent low, the overseer's voice sharp, the ships loading barrels heavy with the future cravings of a queen. This is not to sour the taste, but to remind us that junk food has always had shadows. The cost of easy sweetness has always been hidden somewhere. And when you next taste sugar dissolving on your tongue, it is worth remembering that comfort often wears a mask. Still, there is something deeply human about how quickly the shadows were forgotten once the plate was set before her. The queen, like anyone, was not eating history when she ate her sweets. She was eating pleasure. She was chasing that small, bright moment of comfort, that fleeting sense that life, for all its heaviness, could pause for a bite. And perhaps that is why junk food is so powerful. It does not ask us to reckon with its journey. It simply asks us to taste. So let yourself drift into that thought now. Picture her sitting in Osborne House, the sea air pressing faintly at the windows, the tray set before her with tea steaming and cakes waiting. Picture her lifting one, the sponge soft, the jam thick, and taking a bite with a small hum of satisfaction. Outside, the empire groaned and churned. Workers sweated. Children shouted in streets sticky with spilled syrup. But in that single moment of indulgence, the queen was simply human, caught in the same net of craving that still holds us now. And that is how the empire shaped junk food, not only through trade and conquest, but through the way it carried pleasure across boundaries, through the way it made sweetness common, through the way it linked queen and commoner, palace and street. To tell this story is not to excuse the shadows, but to see how deeply they are woven into our history, how much of our present hunger is tethered to those past cravings. So as you lie there now, listening, perhaps letting your eyes slip heavier, think of that web, stretched across oceans, pulled tight across centuries, binding your midnight snack to a queen's sponge cake, your cup of sweetened coffee to her tea, your chocolate bar to the confections she adored. The indulgence you know today is not new, it is the echo of an empire, the shadow of cravings that once reached the lips of Queen Victoria herself. And as you let that thought settle, let it soothe you. Because in knowing that even the grandest lives were softened by the same small desires, you might feel a little less alone in your own. If sweetness was the gentle mask of empire, then beneath that mask lurked something far more unsettling. Because the Victorian age was not only a world of indulgence, it was a world of adulteration, where the hunger for cheap pleasure met the ruthless economy of industrial shortcuts. And the result was that what passed your lips could just as easily be poison as it was comfort. Imagine the streets again, but now instead of the warm scent of roasted chestnuts or the golden glaze of syrup buns, picture powders being stirred quietly into flour, chalk and alum making bread whiter, copper salts turning pickles, an unnaturally vivid green, lead slipping into candies that sparkled with colors too bright to be natural. The vendors shouted as loudly as before. The children pressed coins into sticky palms. The workers swallowed quickly before returning to machines. And all the while, their bodies carried the hidden burden of toxins disguised as treats. Junk food in this age was never only indulgence. It was also risk, the silent gamble of every bite. And yet, the craving never slowed. Londoners kept reaching, kept chewing, kept sucking on bright lozenges and gnawing on sugar sticks, because pleasure was more immediate than caution, because in a world where so much was harsh, a little sweetness was worth the hidden cost. Even Queen Victoria, protected as she was by palace chefs and careful suppliers, was not entirely insulated from this darker side of indulgence. Her kitchens prided themselves on quality, but the very ingredients that entered them flowed from the same markets that fed the rest of the city, and the same shadows that haunted the alleys sometimes crept into the palace pantry. Think of it, a cake prepared with jam thick and sweet, but that jam perhaps stretched with starches or tinted with dyes. A sweetmeat glazed to perfection, but the glaze shining with something not quite safe. She might never have known, and perhaps she never cared to know, because indulgence has always thrived on turning away from questions. The scandal of Victorian food adulteration was whispered about in pamphlets, printed in newspapers, argued in Parliament. But for the ordinary eater, it remained invisible until the body faltered. Children sickened after too many candies. Women fainted after pickles dyed with copper. Men grew weak from bread bulked with chalk. And still they bought more. Still they ate, because hunger and craving did not wait for reform. The Queen herself was not so different in spirit, though her food was safer. She too allowed desire to overcome caution. She too reached for the second slice, the sugared biscuit, the heavy pudding that weighed down her body, even as it lifted her spirits. In that way, she mirrored her people once again. They all risked the shadows for the promise of a moment's comfort. Picture it more closely with me. A child in the East End, sticky with syrup, lips stained red from candies colored with cochineal and lead, smiling despite the faint ache in his belly. Then picture the Queen at Osborne House, lifting a fork heavy with cake, her cheeks softening as she chewed, the sweetness briefly easing the sorrow of widowhood. Different worlds, different risks, yet united by the same truth that indulgence in this era carried its own poison, both literal and metaphorical. For the poor, the poison was chemical, slipped into their food by profiteers. For the Queen, the poison was excess, indulgence unchecked by need. her body slowly bearing the weight of too much abundance. And here is where junk food in the Victorian sense takes on its most haunting form. It was never just about taste, it was about illusion, about making food look more vibrant, more plentiful, more desirable than it truly was. The same way a candy glimmered too brightly, a bun shone too golden, a pickle too green, so too did indulgence itself glimmer brighter than it was, promising comfort, but often delivering consequence. And in this, we see the first outlines of a pattern that still exists today, the way cheap pleasure can mask hidden dangers, the way craving blinds us to cost. Queen Victoria's own body became a canvas for this truth. In her youth, she was lively, quick, stubborn. In her middle years, she was still strong, commanding. But as the decades passed, her appetite never dimmed, and she grew heavier, slower, her health increasingly fragile. It was not poison dyes or copper salts that felled her, but the steady accumulation of indulgence, the cakes and sweets and puddings that had once been small comforts but over time became burdens. She was not alone in this, for her people too bore the consequences of their cravings, their teeth rotting from sugar, their stomachs unsettled by adulterants, their lives shortened by foods that promised comfort but carried cost. In this way, queen and commoner were once again bound, not by shared meals, but by shared vulnerability to the shadow side of indulgence. And yet, do not let the shadows darken the whole picture. There is something strangely tender in it too, something deeply human. Because who among us has not chosen the quick bite despite knowing it was unwise? Who has not reached for sugar when the heart ached? Who has not let a craving quiet the louder voice of caution? If you let yourself feel that, lying here in the stillness, you might sense how close she really was to us, how her cravings, her indulgences, her willingness to risk comfort over caution make her not just a monarch but a mirror. So when we think of Victorian junk food, we must see it whole. The brightness and the danger, the comfort and the cost, the queen's indulgences and the people's gambles, all woven together into a tapestry of craving that defined an age. And as you drift with me deeper into that world, let the image linger. A palace kitchen preparing sugared buns, a London alley glowing with candies too bright to be safe, both serving the same quiet hunger, both promising the same fleeting sweetness, both carrying shadows beneath their shine. That is the rhythm of indulgence, then as now always comforting, always risky, always human. There is something about leisure that sharpens craving, as though the very act of stepping away from labor or duty makes the body long for sweetness, for grease, for all that is easy and excessive. And in the Victorian world, this was no less true than in ours. Imagine the new railways stretching out across England, steel veins carrying families from soot-dark cities toward the sea, carriages rattling with the sound of wheels, and the muffled laughter of children pressing their noses to the glass. For the first time, leisure was not only for the privileged. The trains carried workers, shopkeepers, clerks, all hungry not only for fresh air, but for treats they could not find in the cramped alleys of London. And when they arrived, when they stepped out into the salt-stung air of Brighton or Margate, what greeted them was not just the sea but a carnival of indulgence. Stalls lined with sticky sweets, gingerbread men grinning through sugar glaze, toffee stretched and pulled into shining ropes, fried fish carried hot in paper, and roasted nuts tumbling with a metallic clink into small cones. Seaside Britain was where junk food became not only survival or rebellion but celebration, where indulgence was woven into the very idea of leisure. Queen Victoria herself was no stranger to these seaside rituals. Osborne House on the Isle of Wight became her refuge, a place where the sea whispered against the shore and her children ran barefoot across the sand. And though her meals there were still overseen by chefs, there was something about the sea that loosened formality. She ate more simply, more freely, and though the plates might not have been wrapped in paper cones like those carried by the crowds, the spirit of indulgence was the same. Imagine her watching her children licking their fingers after sugared almonds. Imagine her own hand hovering over a plate of cakes, softer in her gaze because the setting was softer too. Leisure blurs boundaries, and in leisure, even a queen allows herself to eat as though she were simply a mother at the seaside, caught in the same tide of appetite that swept through the nation. The fairs carried the same energy, a riot of noise and color. Rides that clattered with iron chains, barkers shouting promises of thrills, and everywhere, food that was more spectacle than sustenance. Candy floss spun like clouds of sugar, bright pink and impossible to resist. Toffee apples shone with a lacquered glaze, cracking under teeth with a sound that echoed against the din. Fried dough sizzled in pans that never cooled, filling the air with a sweetness that clung to hair and clothes long after you walked away. These were not foods to nourish. They were foods to delight, to stain lips and fingers, to make leisure itself taste of sugar and oil. And though Victoria did not walk the fairs like her subjects, she understood the spirit of them, because she too craved foods that existed for no reason but pleasure. In her banquets and teas, echoes of the fair could be found: candied fruits, spun sugar decorations, puddings that trembled with sweetness. The difference was not in kind, only in presentation. It is worth lingering on this, because leisure gave birth to a new kind of junk food, one that did not disguise itself as meal or necessity but openly declared itself as excess. A bun bought on a workday might be meant to fill the stomach cheaply, but a toffee apple on the seaside was meant only to glimmer, to crunch, to make the day brighter. And in that shift, we see how deeply indulgence had sunk into the Victorian soul. It was no longer only about easing hunger or softening grief. It was about marking joy, about tying sweetness to memory. Think of a child biting into candy at the shore, the taste forever braided with the sound of waves. Think of Victoria eating a sweet at Osborne, the sugar tied forever to the salt air and the laughter of children she adored. That is how junk food becomes not only taste but time, not only comfort but memory itself. The railway journeys deepened this truth. Picture the stations crowded with vendors, shouting above the hiss of steam, selling buns, pies, roasted peanuts, all meant to be carried into carriages and eaten while the countryside slid past in a blur. For the first time, food became portable indulgence, something eaten not at tables but in motion, a forerunner of the snacks we carry on highways and flights today. Victoria's own train journeys were supplied with hampers, carefully prepared, but even in that refinement lay the same spirit. Food made to be eaten while traveling, food chosen for comfort rather than ceremony. To unwrap a bun as the train clattered forward was to join a new rhythm of indulgence, one where movement itself encouraged craving. And in all of this, the Queen remained both apart and within. She did not stand at sticky stalls or shout across crowded platforms, but her cravings were shaped by the same tide that shaped her people's. She tasted sugar not only in palaces but in leisure homes. She allowed indulgence to flow more freely in the sea air. She embraced the idea that certain foods were not for hunger but for happiness. That was the quiet revolution of leisure in the Victorian age. The recognition that junk food was not only a guilty escape but a rightful part of joy. That leisure tasted sweetest when your hands were sticky and your lips were sugared. So as you drift with me now, think of how closely this resembles your own world. How closely it resembles the way we mark our moments of leisure with popcorn at movies, cotton candy at carnivals, hot dogs at ball games. The pattern is the same. Movement away from duty creates space for indulgence, and indulgence becomes the taste of memory. Victoria's Britain was simply where the pattern took its first powerful shape, and she, knowingly or not, was part of its spread. And so the story deepens. Junk food was no longer only the whisper of the kitchen or the gamble of the street. It became the companion of leisure, the badge of joy, the sweetness tied forever to moments of escape. It was there on the seashore, in the railway carriage, in the laughter of fairs. And it was there too, in the Queen's own indulgences, softened by the air of Osborne, brightened by the joy of her children. To taste those foods was to taste not only sugar but freedom, fleeting though it was, and that truth has never left us. Night has a way of sharpening cravings, doesn't it? In the hush after duties are done, when the lamps burn lower and the corridors stretch long and silent, the body begins to whisper for small comforts, for tastes that carry no purpose but pleasure. And in Buckingham Palace, despite the grandeur of chandeliers and the unyielding weight of duty, Queen Victoria was not immune to the pull of these midnight whispers. Imagine the vastness of her world reduced, after banquets and ceremonies were ended, to a quiet room where she sat alone. The heavy velvet curtains drawn against the dark, the air perfumed faintly with wax, from candles guttering in silver holders. In those hours, when protocol retreated into the shadows, The queen reached not for state papers or speeches, but often for food. Indulgences carried up discreetly from the kitchens, trays of small cakes or sweetmeats, or even little fried morsels, meant not for the stomach's need, but for the heart's longing. It is tempting to think of her only as a figure of authority, always guarded, always formal, but the truth of her nights was softer and lonelier. After Albert's death, the silence pressed in heavier, and food became one of the few companions that never failed her. Imagine her seated in Osborne House, the sea beyond her windows dark and restless, her children grown, her court hushed. On a small table beside her, rested plates brought quietly by servants slices of sponge cake thick with cream, candied fruits glistening under candlelight, almonds roasted until their skins cracked, and their scent filled the air. She would take a piece slowly, the fork sinking into softness, the sugar melting on her tongue, and for a moment, however brief, she was no longer sovereign, no longer widow, but simply a woman reaching for sweetness against the weight of solitude. There is something deeply moving in picturing her like this, isn't there? Because you and I know the same pull. You have felt it yourself, those moments when the clock slides past midnight, and suddenly the kitchen calls to you, when a bag of chips or a cookie seems like the only thing that can ease the ache of being awake too long. That is the bridge that spans centuries, the quiet craving of late hours. The queen's plate might have been finer, her food more carefully arranged, but the yearning it answered was the same. Junk food is not only about hunger, it is about loneliness, about needing something tangible when the intangible presses too hard. For Victoria, these indulgences grew more frequent as the years passed. In her journals and in the accounts of her staff, there are hints of how strong her appetite remained, how she demanded second helpings, how trays of sweets and puddings followed her not only at meals, but into her private hours. Her servants, trained to obey without question, learned to anticipate her cravings, to keep kitchens warm late into the night, to ensure that when the queen asked, there would always be something ready, something sweet, something fried, something indulgent enough to ease her mind. And in that cycle, food became more than sustenance. It became a balm, a soft hand against the rawness of grief. Picture the sound of it, the faint knock at her chamber door, the hush of footsteps on thick carpets, the quiet clink of porcelain set upon a small table. No trumpets, no ceremony, just the intimate delivery of a treat meant to soothe. Perhaps it was a slice of plum cake, dense and heavy, studded with raisins that burst with sweetness as she bit into them. Perhaps it was chocolate, smooth and dark, melting slowly on her tongue while the world outside remained cold and unyielding. Or perhaps it was something as simple as bread spread thick with butter and jam, comfort food in its purest form, eaten slowly while she stared into the shadows. These are not images of grandeur, but they are images of truth, and truth is always softer than spectacle. And in those moments, she was closer to her people than she ever knew. Because outside the palace walls, in narrow London rooms lit by single lamps, other sleepless souls reached for their own midnight snacks, workers gnawing on leftover buns, children sucking the last sweetness from boiled candies, mothers saving a crust spread with syrup as a stolen comfort. The queen's solitude was gilded, theirs was ragged, but all were tied to the same quiet hunger of the night. Junk food was the language of that hunger, a universal dialect of comfort that spoke equally in palaces and in alleys. But indulgence, when repeated night after night, becomes its own kind of burden. Victoria grew heavier, her health more fragile, her body slowed by the very foods that had comforted her. In this, too, she mirrored her people, who paid their own price for cheap sweets and adulterated treats. And yet the cycle continued, because the pull of comfort is stronger than the whisper of consequence, especially in the silent hours when loneliness sharpens every craving. The queen, for all her power, could not command the night to be less empty. So she filled it instead with food, with bites that promised sweetness, if not companionship. And here is the paradox. Those small indulgences, those late-night snacks, were both her solace and her undoing. They soothed her spirit while weighing down her body. They answered her grief while deepening her dependence. They gave her comfort while carving their quiet cost. That paradox is the heart of junk food itself. It heals while it harms, it comforts while it corrodes, it feels immediate while leaving shadows that last. And in Victoria's long reign, That paradox played out not only in her own chambers but across the empire she ruled. So let yourself drift into that vision. The queen alone, the plate before her, the sugar softening the ache of loss, the night deep around her. Think of your own nights when you have done the same, reaching for food not because you were hungry but because you were human, because the heart needed what the stomach pretended to ask for. In that shared truth lies the intimacy of history, the reminder that even in the grandest palaces, the quiet hours of craving were the same as they are in your own home. And as you let that thought settle, allow yourself to see her not as a figure locked in portraits, but as a woman caught in the same restless rhythm of the night, listening to the same whispers of her body, reaching for the same fleeting comfort of indulgence. That is where the story of junk food deepens, not only in markets and fairs, not only in kitchens and banquets, but in the lonely silences of the night, where food becomes a companion, a balm, a fragile stand-in for the warmth of another presence. If you let the picture widen now, stretching past the velvet curtains of Buckingham Palace and beyond the sooty streets of London, you begin to see that junk food in the age of Queen Victoria was not only a private indulgence or a local habit, but a ripple that reached far beyond Britain's shores, carried on ships heavy with cargo, spreading cravings as surely as it spread culture and rule. The empire was not only a political machine, it was also a palate, one that trained millions to taste sugar, to long for tea sweetened to excess, to find pleasure in chocolate, in spice, in biscuits that crumbled sweetly on the tongue. And what began as indulgence in the Queen's drawing rooms became a quiet contagion of appetite across the globe. Picture India under the weight of empire, plantations bending under the weight of tea leaves, rows of workers stooping in humid fields, their sweat bound invisibly into the leaves that would later steam in porcelain cups thousands of miles away. The British did not only export governance, they exported rituals, and none more powerful than the ritual of tea. Tea that for Victoria was inseparable from cakes, biscuits, and sweet indulgences. And so, in the colonial cities where British officials lived, bakeries appeared, selling sponge cakes and buns, sugar-dusted tarts, small echoes of London's cravings transplanted into foreign soil. The locals saw them, tasted them, sometimes adopted them, sometimes resisted them. But the flavor of empire was always present, carried in every crumb of sugar. In the Caribbean, the story twisted again, for it was from those islands that so much of the sugar itself came, a sweetness wrung from cane fields where labor had long been brutal. And yet, as time passed, the very communities once bound to harvest sugar began to consume it, shaping their own versions of indulgence, blending British sweets with local fruits, frying dough into shapes that bore little resemblance to Victoria's dainty cakes, but carried the same spirit of comfort. Junk food, in its way, became a language spoken by all, though with different accents, different forms, depending on who held the spoon. Think also of Canada, of Australia, of the far edges of the empire where British settlers clung to their rituals like lifelines. They built tea shops and bakeries. They carried recipes for puddings and cakes. And in those foods, they kept a sense of home, even as they lived half a world away. And always, hovering above them as both figure and influence, was Victoria, the monarch whose own sweet tooth gave permission for indulgence, whose name marked the era, whose habits became cultural gravity. When settlers baked plum cakes for holidays, when they boiled puddings heavy with dried fruits, they were not only feeding themselves but tying themselves back to a queen who loved the same indulgences. Junk food was no longer just a private comfort. It was the thread that tied colonies to crown, a taste that reinforced identity even as it crossed oceans. And yet, empire is never without its contradictions. The very foods that spread outward were also reshaped by the lands they touched. Indian cooks added spices to biscuits that startled English palates. Caribbean kitchens blended sugar with tropical fruits in ways the palace never imagined. Australian bakers stretched recipes to fit the ingredients they had, creating cakes that were heavier, sweeter, sturdier, perfect for long journeys. These were no longer purely British indulgences, but hybrids, foods that bore both the mark of empire and the stamp of local soil. Junk food, in this age, was already global, already mutating, already teaching the world that cravings know no borders. And Victoria herself, though she might never have tasted these altered forms, was the quiet center of it all. Her portrait hung in colonial offices. Her name marked the years, and her habits, her cravings, her endless appetite for sweets and cakes, rippled outward as cultural cues. People copied her not by decree but by desire, imitating the rituals of tea, the indulgences of cakes, the idea that leisure and sweetness belonged together. To eat as the queen ate was to feel closer to empire, to feel a part of something larger, to anchor yourself in the rhythm of a world ruled from afar. Junk food became not only comfort but identity, a way of tasting belonging even in foreign lands. If you pause here with me, you can see how the story bends toward the present. Because what was happening then, sweetness spreading outward, indulgence tied to leisure, cravings exported alongside politics, was the beginning of something we still live in today. A global palate shaped by empire, where chocolate, sugar, fried dough, biscuits, and sweets belong to everyone, though their roots are tangled in histories both tender and bitter. Victoria's Britain did not invent craving, but it industrialized it, globalized it, turned indulgence into a cultural force that could leap oceans. And she, sitting with her cakes and her teas, was both participant and emblem. It is comforting, in a strange way, to know that the chocolate bar in your hand, the sweet soda at your side, the donut melting sugar on your tongue, all have a lineage that stretches back through those ships, through those plantations, through those kitchens, back to a queen who could not resist her own midnight plate. The indulgence you know now is simply the echo of hers, magnified across time, reshaped across continents, but carrying the same truth, that sweetness, though fleeting, feels like belonging. So let your thoughts drift across that map. India with its fields of tea, the Caribbean with its cane, Australia with its sturdy cakes, Canada with its winter puddings, and picture how each was bound not only by rule but by craving, by foods that comforted and harmed, delighted and addicted, spread and transformed. This is the deeper truth of junk food in Victoria's world. It was not only a bite in a palace, not only a bun in a London street, it was a wave that reshaped how millions ate, how millions remembered comfort. And at the heart of that wave sat a queen whose appetite mirrored her empire, expansive, unyielding, forever hungry for more. There is a curious irony in the Victorian age, that time when rules were etched into every corner of life, when etiquette manuals multiplied like sermons, when morality was measured not only in actions but in appearances. And yet it was also an age of indulgence, an age where sugar coursed through every vein of society, where cakes and puddings and sweets appeared on tables with a frequency that astonished outsiders. Discipline and indulgence coexisted like uneasy bedfellows, one forever wagging its finger, the other forever slipping another spoonful of jam onto the plate. And Queen Victoria, the figurehead of that world, embodied this contradiction more vividly than most. She was praised for her sense of duty, her unyielding presence, her role as moral compass of the empire. But she was also known, sometimes whispered about, for her remarkable appetite, her tendency to eat with gusto, her refusal to restrain herself when sweets were served. In a society that tied morality to restraint, this was both shocking and oddly comforting. For if even the queen surrendered to craving, what chance did anyone else have? Imagine the dining rooms of respectable middle-class homes, the father lecturing about thrift and discipline, the mother urging moderation, while on the table rested a heavy pudding drenched in syrup or a plate of sponge cakes thick with cream. The same family that scolded gluttony would nevertheless carve generous slices, for to deny pleasure entirely was impossible. This was the paradox of the Victorian moral world. Sin was condemned, but temptation was ever present, and indulgence found its way in through the kitchen, even as it was banished from the pulpit. Junk food, if we borrow that phrase for their world, became not only a craving but a moral test, a mirror in which people saw both their weakness and their humanity. And Victoria herself was often the subject of that mirror. Observers noted how heartily she ate, how swiftly she cleared her plate, how she demanded second helpings even when decorum suggested otherwise. For some, it was proof of her vitality, of her refusal to be bound by dainty expectations of femininity. For others, it was unseemly, almost sinful. A queen who indulged too much in food while preaching discipline to her nation. But she was no hypocrite. She never pretended to fast while secretly feasting. She simply lived the contradiction openly, embodying the Victorian struggle between appetite and restraint. There is something profoundly human in this, something you might recognize in yourself. Have you ever promised to cut back on sweets, only to find yourself reaching for one more cookie after dinner? Have you ever told yourself discipline was the path, only to let indulgence win when the night grew too quiet? That was the Victorian experience writ large. Sermons about morality paired with tables overflowing with desserts. Advice about thrift paired with extravagant displays of sugar. They lived in contradiction, and they made peace with it not by eliminating indulgence, but by wrapping it in ritual. Sunday dinners, afternoon teas, holiday puddings, these were moments when indulgence was sanctified, when sin became tradition, when craving disguised itself as culture. The Queen, again, mirrored this perfectly. Her afternoon teas were not acts of rebellion but rituals, expected, respected, elevated almost to the level of sacrament. She could eat her cakes, and no one could accuse her of sin, for tea was tradition, and tradition cleansed indulgence of its guilt. This is how morality bends. It does not erase desire, it baptizes it in ritual. It finds ways to turn what could be judged into what must be accepted. Junk food in that age wore a cloak of ceremony, and so long as the cloak remained, the sin beneath it was forgiven. But in private, in the silences of the night we touched upon before, indulgence stripped of ritual carried a sharper edge. To eat alone, to eat without ceremony, to eat because of craving rather than custom, that was where morality's whispers grew louder. For the Queen, perhaps, the weight of this whisper was muted by her position. But for her subjects, the guilt of indulgence was real. Workers who spent their pennies on sweets rather than savings, mothers who gave children candies dyed with dangerous colors, fathers who lingered at pubs with fried food instead of returning to families, all were judged harshly by the moral standards of the time. Junk food was not just food. It was temptation, weakness, proof of flawed character. And yet, everyone succumbed. This contradiction seeped into literature, into sermons, into the quiet judgments passed across tables. Gluttony had long been listed as a deadly sin, and yet Victorian kitchens poured forth puddings heavy with brandy, cakes laden with sugar, fried fritters sold in every fairground. To live in that age was to live in constant negotiation with temptation, to walk the line between morality and craving, and to fail more often than not. But perhaps that failure was itself a kind of relief, a reminder that to be human was not to be perfect, but to be pulled between desire and discipline. And so, as you lie here listening, you might begin to see why Queen Victoria's appetite mattered. It was not gossip, it was symbol. It told her people that even the sovereign, even the figure meant to embody duty, was caught in the same net of craving as they were. Her indulgence softened her image, made her more human, even as it scandalized some. And in that, we see the strange power of junk food. It erodes hierarchies. It reveals the hidden sameness beneath roles and rules. To crave is to belong to humanity, and no crown could protect her from that. Think of it then, as a kind of morality play played out on plates. Every bite carried meaning. Every indulgence weighed against discipline. Every cake judged as both comfort and weakness. The Victorians lived in this constant dialogue, and we still do. When you pick up a donut, do you not hear the same whisper? Should you? Shouldn't you? Will you regret it? Will you allow it? The stage has changed, but the play is the same, and Victoria was simply one of its most visible actors, caught between appetite and expectation. So let that thought carry you, gently, into the recognition that morality has always been less about eliminating desire and more about managing it, dressing it, excusing it, sanctifying it when possible, hiding it when not. And in the Victorian world, junk food was not only a taste but a test. Not only pleasure, but a mirror of the soul. Queen Victoria's cravings, her hearty appetite, her visible indulgences, were not just quirks of personality. They were reflections of an age wrestling with the eternal tension between sin and sweetness, between discipline and desire, between the life they preached and the lives they lived. And perhaps, as you drift toward rest, you can smile at that recognition, because the same struggle plays out in you, in me, in all of us. And it is strangely comforting to know that a queen once sat with the same dilemma on her plate, that she too reached for sweetness when she might have abstained, that she too lived in the soft contradiction of craving and morality. History, in the end, is not so much about difference as about sameness, and junk food, humble as it seems, is proof of that sameness. If craving in the Victorian age lived quietly in kitchens and softly in lonely hours, it also thundered in public halls, because indulgence was never only private, it was staged, performed, displayed in banquets that sprawled for hours, in holidays that demanded tables to sag beneath the weight of puddings and roasts, in spectacles where food became theater. Imagine the long tables gleaming with crystal and silver, stretching like rivers through gilded rooms, candles flickering in ranks that seemed endless, the hum of voices mixing with the shuffle of servants as dish after dish was carried in. These banquets were not meals in the simple sense. They were declarations, proclamations in edible form, proof of abundance, proof of empire, proof that Britain under Victoria was a land where indulgence was not scarce but staged. And at the head of those tables sat the Queen herself, expected to embody moderation and yet known for her hearty appetite, her willingness to eat with vigor while the world watched. It is easy, lying here now, to imagine the spectacle from above, the polished plates, the towering puddings, the meats carved with ceremony, but let your mind drop lower, to the level of the senses, to the smells and textures that filled those halls. The air was heavy with roasting fat, with gravies thick and steaming, with sugar that caramelized and burned faintly at the edges, with wine that clung sharp and sweet to the back of the throat. The clink of forks and knives was steady, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter, the sharp ring of crystal struck by accident, the muffled cough of someone who had eaten too quickly. Food was not only eaten, it was performed, each bite taken under the gaze of others, each dish arriving as part of a procession that blurred the line between meal and theater. For the Queen, these banquets were duty as much as indulgence, yet they also revealed her humanity. Because she did not nibble politely, she ate with enthusiasm. Observers noted the speed with which she cleared her plate, the clear delight she took in desserts, the way she sometimes startled foreign guests by her frankness at table. It was not daintiness, it was appetite. And in a hall where every movement was measured, appetite itself became performance. To see the Queen eat heartily was to see her as both sovereign and woman, both symbol of empire and participant in its indulgence. Junk food may seem far from such gilded tables, yet in the puddings soaked with sugar, in the candied fruits, in the cakes layered with jam and cream, the spirit of excess was the same, food that existed more for pleasure than nourishment, food that declared abundance in a world where scarcity was still close at hand. Beyond the palace, the same spirit of spectacle repeated itself in holidays that brought entire communities to the table. Christmas in the Victorian age became a feast of almost reckless indulgence, a season when even the poor sought to scrape together enough for plum pudding, when middle-class families roasted geese or turkeys until their skins crackled, when tables overflowed with mince pies and sugared treats, and at the center of it all was pudding, boiled for hours, dense and dark, spiced and sweet, heavy with dried fruit, and soaked in brandy that was set alight so the dessert arrived at the table blazing, a theatrical flourish that drew gasps and laughter. To eat this was not simply to eat, it was to participate in ritual, in spectacle, in the communal affirmation that indulgence had a place in life. For the Queen, Christmas was no less lavish, her tables groaning under dishes prepared for days, her family gathered around while puddings flamed and sweets sparkled. And in those moments, indulgence was sanctified not by ritual alone but by joy itself, by the belief that certain days demanded excess, demanded that comfort spill beyond moderation. Think also of public feasts, civic banquets thrown to mark victories or royal occasions, where thousands of people sat in great halls or tents, where joints of meat were carved endlessly, where barrels of ale and trays of pies circulated until even the poorest guests were full. These events transformed food into theater of power, indulgence into proof of stability. The empire was strong, the Queen was generous, the people were fed, such was the message whispered in every bite. Junk food in this context was not merely snack or craving, it was part of the show. Sweets piled high on tables to dazzle, fried treats served to crowds in celebration, excess displayed as proof that all was well. And yet, beneath the spectacle, the same contradictions lurked. For while banquets declared abundance, many still lived in hunger. While puddings blazed with brandy in rich homes, poor families made do with thin gruel. To attend a feast was to see not only food but hierarchy, indulgence as a marker of who belonged where. And still, the craving united them all, because whether in gilded halls or humble parlors, the sight of a sugared cake or the smell of roasted chestnuts sparked the same yearning, the same hunger that tied queen and commoner together. In this way, spectacle revealed what had always been true, that junk food, indulgence, comfort food, whatever name we give, it carries meaning far beyond the stomach. It is identity, it is celebration, it is performance, it is rebellion, it is solace. For Victoria, the banquets displayed her power, but also her humanity. For her people, the feasts reminded them of both their place in the world and their shared craving for sweetness. To eat together, even in inequality, was to bind society in a strange, fragile way. So as you rest with me here, picture one of those banquets as though you were seated at the edge. Watch the servants moving in perfect rhythm. Hear the crackle of fire from a pudding set ablaze. Smell the sugar and spice that linger in the air long after the dish has been cleared. See the queen lifting her fork, her appetite evident, her presence both grand and startlingly ordinary in that moment. Feel the way the room itself seemed to throb with indulgence, the way the performance of abundance soothed fears of scarcity, the way sweetness in excess became a comfort not only to individuals, but to an entire society restless with change. And in that vision, you will see why junk food in the Victorian world was more than snack or treat. It was a performance of who they believed themselves to be. It was abundance on display, appetite turned into theater, craving sanctified by spectacle. And as the candles gutter low in your imagination, as the banquet fades into the hush of night, remember that behind all the pomp and ceremony was the same simple truth. People craved comfort, people sought sweetness, people turned indulgence into memory. And Queen Victoria, sitting at the head of her endless tables, was simply the most visible of them all. In the last years of her reign, when the world knew her less as the young girl who once startled courtiers with her laughter, and more as the widow dressed forever in black, Queen Victoria's relationship with indulgence had settled into something almost mythic, a pattern as steady as the ticking of a clock, her appetite as famous as her crown. She was no longer nimble. Her body bore the years, the grief, the weight of countless meals, and yet her cravings remained as insistent as ever. Servants recorded how she still ate with remarkable vigor, how desserts disappeared quickly from her plate, how trays of puddings, cakes, and sugared fruits were prepared not only for formal meals, but for the quiet moments in between. The Queen of England, Empress of India, ruler of lands stretching across oceans, still sought comfort and sweetness, still reached for the small indulgences that soothed her heart, even as her body bent under their cost. It is easy to imagine her now, as the portraits often show her. Broad, stern, wrapped in heavy gowns. Her face lined, her presence immense. But look closer with your imagination and soften the edges. See the private woman behind the public image, seated in her rooms at Balmoral or Osborne, a tray of treats beside her, her hand steady even in age as she lifted fork to mouth. The sweetness she craved was no longer about novelty, it was habit, solace, a rhythm too familiar to break. Every cake was not only a bite of sugar but a memory. Every sweet not only a comfort but a thread to the life she had lived. To Albert, to her children, to decades of ritual. Indulgence by then was less rebellion than ritualized companionship, a way of reminding herself that she was still alive, still capable of pleasure, even as the empire and the century pressed heavily upon her. And here lies the metaphor too large to ignore. Her body itself became a mirror of the empire she ruled. As she grew heavier, slower, more unwieldy, so too did Britain stretch outward, swollen with colonies, burdened with the weight of expansion, slowed by the very abundance it had created. The Queen's appetite reflected an imperial appetite, always craving more, always reaching further, always feeding upon resources pulled from distant lands, always heavy with consequences that could not yet be fully seen. Her love of sweets and fried morsels was not so different from the empire's love of sugar and tea and chocolate, the hunger insatiable, the indulgence constant, the shadow of excess inevitable. Yet, in her presence, people found comfort in that appetite. To see their queen eat with relish was to see her human, to see her as one of them. Someone who craved as they craved, someone who did not float above the earth but was tethered by the same needs. And perhaps, too, there was something reassuring in her largeness, in the way she filled a room, in the way her body seemed to embody stability, solidity, permanence. For a nation anxious with change, with industrial upheaval, with the restless tremors of politics and colonies, her form itself seemed to declare endurance. The indulgence that weighed her down also made her feel immovable, like the empire itself, too vast to falter, too heavy to topple, too enduring to vanish. But nothing endures forever. And in those final years, her indulgence also carried whispers of fragility. Doctors fretted over her health, servants worried over her breathless steps. Observers noted how difficult it became for her to move. She still ate with the same appetite, but the body that had once absorbed excess now labored under it. Indulgence, once comfort, became chain, binding her to habits she could not escape. The empire too showed signs of strain. Colonies restless, costs mounting, contradictions widening. Just as her body bore the price of a lifetime of sweets and puddings, so too did the empire bear the weight of its cravings, its hunger for land, its endless indulgence in conquest and trade. And yet here is the tenderness of it. The queen did not abandon her indulgences, nor did her people abandon theirs. Because food, in the end, is not only about health or consequence. It is about the need to be soothed, the need to mark time with sweetness, the need to find comfort in the tangible when the intangible weighs too heavily. Victoria's cakes and puddings were not simply failures of discipline. They were lifelines, small anchors in the storm of age and grief. And her people's sweets, their fried fish, their sugared buns, were not only poisons, they were the same lifelines, the same anchors in lives of labor and hardship. Junk food, indulgence, comfort food, whatever name you give it, was not only weakness, it was survival of another kind. So picture her one last time, near the end, seated in Windsor Castle, her body frail beneath its size, her hand still steady as she lifted a sweet to her lips. The empire stretched outward, the century neared its close, and yet in that moment, she was simply a woman, finding solace in sugar. The indulgence was both symbol and reality, symbol of an age too heavy with its own appetite, reality of a human heart that needed comfort. And perhaps that is the most enduring truth, that even in twilight, even in decline, indulgence remains, because craving is the last thread to slip away. As you rest with me in this thought, let it soothe you. Because the queen, for all her crowns and all her colonies, was still bound to the same cravings that bind us now. Her appetite was her humanity, her indulgence, her solace, her body, her mirror of an age. And in seeing her that way, not as a distant sovereign, but as a woman who reached for sweetness until the end, you might feel less burdened by your own late-night cravings, less guilty for the snacks you keep close at hand. Because history, for all its grandeur, is made of these small human truths, and Queen Victoria's junk food was one of them. And now, my friend, as our long wandering through kitchens and streets, through banquets and lonely nights, through the sweetness and the shadows of a queen's appetite comes toward its close, I invite you to linger here with me in the stillness, to let the weight of all these images settle like dust on quiet velvet, to feel not the clamor of history but the hush it leaves behind. Queen Victoria, in all her grandeur and her flaws, in her laughter and her mourning, in her banquets blazing with spectacle and her midnight plates touched only by candlelight, has walked beside us tonight, not as a figure locked in portraits, but as a woman with cravings, a woman with comforts, a woman whose humanity tasted of sugar and bread and butter. And perhaps, as you lie here now, you can sense that what remains is not her crown, not her empire, not even her weighty place in the story of nations, but the small tenderness of craving, the simple truth of a body asking for sweetness, the enduring reminder that even the mightiest are softened by the same hunger that softens you. History is so often told with noise, with cannons, with decrees, with proclamations etched in stone, but the truth is quieter, isn't it? It lives in the clink of a spoon against porcelain, in the hiss of fat on a pan, in the sticky fingers of children on the seaside. in the queen's fork cutting through sponge layered with jam. It is there in the fleeting moments when the heart sought comfort and found it in food that was not necessary but irresistible. Food that we, with our modern eyes, would call junk food, though for them it was simply pleasure. And if you tilt your head just so, you see that the whole sweep of empire, the whole churn of industry, the whole moral weight of the age, was bound up not only in railways and politics, but in sugar and fat and salt, in the cravings that shaped lives more than rules ever could. So let yourself exhale now. Let your shoulders ease. Let your mind drift on this thought. That history, for all its grandeur, is made of small human hungers. The queen herself, widowed and weary, still reached for sweetness when night pressed too heavily. Her people, bent with labor, still reached for buns and fried fish when their pockets were light. Children still clutched candies that stained their tongues bright red. And you, lying here in the dark, have reached for your own small comforts, and in that reaching you are tied to them, across centuries, across oceans, across the walls of palaces and the grime of alleys. Craving is the great democracy of the body, the thread that binds us beyond power, beyond wealth, beyond time itself. There is a kind of peace in that thought, don't you think? To know that you are not alone in your weakness, that even the monarch who ruled over a quarter of the earth's land could not resist her plate of cakes, that even the strictest society, obsessed with morality and restraint, could not deny itself the joy of sugared puddings. The peace lies in accepting that craving is not failure but humanness, that indulgence is not only guilt but solace, that the small sweetness you allow yourself is not so different from the sweetness that soothed a queen. And so, perhaps, the next time you find yourself in your kitchen at midnight, fingers brushing over wrappers and jars, you might remember her, and instead of shame, you might feel companionship. As the 19th century drew to its close, Victoria herself grew slower, heavier, her body carrying the memory of every indulgence, her empire too strained under its own abundance, heavy with colonies, restless with contradictions. And yet, for both queen and country, indulgence remained, because to let go of comfort is harder than to let go of power. She passed eventually, as all do. But the craving did not pass, it lived on in her people, in her children, in us. Junk food, as we call it now, is not invention of our age. It is inheritance. It is the echo of their pleasures, the continuation of their comfort. And that, too, is strangely soothing. To know that what you taste on your tongue tonight is part of a much older story. One that began in kitchens filled with steam and streets filled with shouts. One that linked palaces to alleys. One that united queen and commoner alike. So rest now in that continuity. Let the empire fade from your mind. Let the banquets dissolve into haze. Let the bustling streets grow quiet. Hold instead the softer images. The queen in her room, a plate beside her. A child on a street corner, sticky with sugar. A worker on a train, unwrapping a bun. Hold them like lanterns against the dark, and know that in each is the same truth, that life is heavy, that duty is relentless, but that a bite of sweetness, however small, however fleeting, can be enough to keep us going. And as you let your eyes close, as sleep begins to blur the edges of my voice, carry this with you. History is not meant to scold you, it is meant to comfort you, to show you that you are not alone, that others have lived your cravings before you, that even queens and empires were undone and sustained by the same small hungers. Craving, indulgence, junk food, these are not trivial. They are threads in the great tapestry of being alive. So good night, my friend. Rest easy. And if you wake tomorrow and find yourself reaching for sweetness, do not be too harsh on yourself. Remember instead that Queen Victoria once did the same, that her empire once did the same, that to crave is to belong to the great human story. Let that thought be your lullaby, soft and steady, carrying you into sleep. And when you return tomorrow, perhaps we will wander again into another corner of the past, another quiet truth hidden beneath the noise of history. Until then, may your rest be sweet, and your dreams softer than sugar melting on the tongue. Goodbye.